Hello random viewers and welcome to another episode of this viewer-driven episode of what did we call it? Nope, this is government controlled, that's what it's called. So, here is our first attempt at a rocket going to space. This one is piloted by Jebediah, I believe. Where's that Valentina? It's hard to tell. I have to watch this through a tiny window in post-production. But anyways, solid rocket booster start, just to get it up to altitude. And then the liquid fueled engine kicks in because it's a lot more efficient at these higher altitudes. It also has gimbal control so I can actually steer. It did have a minor problem with fins burning off though, so that's not ideal. We won't be flying it again. And then you also may notice it has this cubicle structure at the top, and that was to help it stay straight on re-entry because I was having issues in simulations with it spinning out of control. So by putting a lot of drag at the top, it made it fly better. And then here I'm trying to extend it just to see how far I can get on the fuel that's on board. Not very far. And then we have a re-entry where the other fin got burned off. A few engine burns, but we eventually ran out of fuel. I got some good science while in orbit space. But the issue is that I forgot I had brought other experiments along because they were hidden inside the rocket. So when I disconnected for landing, you could see there's actual scientific equipment hidden under there. And I was tempted to revert, but realized I didn't really have time, and that was kind of cheaty. So yeah, I saved my cheap budget for later, and you'll see where that came in handy. And then the landing, which went pretty well. So after the landing, we had to get our recovery ships to come out and grab Jebediah, I believe it was, and we get some nice science and money from that, and not really any experience. So I got greedy. I wanted more science. So we're back in the rocket sled, traveling across the Space Center, trying to get over to the grasslands over there. My thought was, hey, this thing probably just barely has enough fuel to make it there. And it does. But it was tight. At this point, I realized I was still not out of the biome of the Space Center, so I had to go a little bit farther. And once I made it over this little hill here, and actually got some time in the air, I was able to get the data I wanted. Here we go, here's the little hop. Yeah, this rocket sled is horribly inefficient. I realized later it has a lot of surface area in contact with the ground, so in a later version I turned those skis and put less of them. That way it's only the very edges and corners in contact with the ground. Unfortunately, that footage is deleted, but I will explain what happened before we finish. Now, this actually is Jebediah. It was Valentina going to space for the first time. I got that mixed up. But he's riding a modified version of the last rocket that Valentina was on. It has some extra solid rocket boosters to get it a little higher, and it actually has an upper stage engine. So once these burn out, it can continue on to that. Here we drop the solid rocket boosters. Now, due to part limitations, this thing does not have a decoupling of the capsule, and I regretted that horribly later, and you will see how that went. Anyways, this stage got us most of the way to space, got very hot, and I don't think the fins actually burned off on this one. They might have burned off later. Yeah, I dropped the stage before that happened. And yep, there go the fins after I detached. And then at the highest points in our orbit, the apoapsis, which is what it is for Kerbin, the name varies based on the body that you are orbiting. I will always call it that because this is Kerbal Space Program, and I don't feel like changing the name. And there's a stable orbit. Jeb stayed in orbit for, I think, 2 rotations around the planet. Got some very valuable data. And then re-entry came. The goal was to keep the engine facing downwards, since the engine has a good amount of thermal volume, I think is the proper word for it. That way it can absorb a lot of heat and not let the rest of the capsule explode. Unfortunately, that did not go as I expected. Using fuel to keep oriented, it still exploded. As you can clearly see, the engine went and then it flipped around forward, and the rest of it went. So, fortunately, had a quick save, but same thing happened again, even with more careful flying. So here's my cheap budget. I turned down the re-entry heating, but that was a mistake too, because, yeah, I couldn't slow down enough. So then I finally realized I had to save that little bit of maneuvering fuel to slow down just enough so I could open the parachute. So yeah, this is kind of cheaty. I'm going to say that it was favorable atmospheric conditions, making a low pressure zone, let's say, at low temperatures in the atmosphere, so that it wasn't quite as bad as it would otherwise be. And I was doing little puffs of the engine along the way down, and we're going to say that all these factors combined to barely make the re-entry survivable. I know that's not exactly a satisfying answer, and my cheat budget is now completely expended, and I will not be able to use that anymore throughout this series unless I deem it absolutely necessary. But yeah, I really shouldn't be doing that. Anyways, got the science and decided to upgrade the launch pad. Later upgraded the spaceplane hangar so that I could build an extremely basic aircraft. And it is complicated. I don't have engines, I don't have wheels, so I had to use those angled girder pieces to let it slide along the ground the same way the rocket sled did later. It's a pain to fly because I don't have the technology for movable control surfaces. You know, airplanes have ailerons, elevators, rudders that can deflect air to steer. Yeah, no, I don't have any of that technology. What I do have is engine gimbal and reaction wheels. But of course I made the rule I'm not allowed to use reaction wheels for spacecrafts. So, in the context of this, I'm using them as we're just going to say they're weight shift controls. So, I'm shifting weights around using electric motors, and I'm going to say that is an acceptable use of reaction wheels at this current technology level. Later on, when I unlock actual reaction wheels, maybe I'll allow myself to use them on spacecrafts, but for now, that's how it's going to be. As you can see, this thing is horrible at steering as a result. It is not maneuverable at all, but it can land. In early versions where I had the skis more like the rocket sled, where they had a lot of friction, I had issues with it flipping forwards. So, as a result, as a precautionary measure, I deployed parachutes just about every time I landed this thing early. That being early on in this point in the program. Later in the video, you can see I got more comfortable with landing it without parachutes, and it actually went just fine. One of the other modifications I made is extending the craft. So you can see we only used a few hundred credits actually worth of fuel. We got all the costs back. So now, Valentina, and I believe that is Bill, maybe it's Bob, it's hard to say, they decided to fly over to the grasslands and look at the nice trees, get some science, and I stumbled across one of those new terrain features in the Breaking Ground expansion. I don't know what it's called, it's just one of those weird looking trees. So I landed over by it. I'm still using the parachutes, of course. Those really do help. No flipping forward tendencies, which was very nice. You can see the wings are actually those fins that it burn off easily, all just constructed in a crazy way. Anyways, here's the tree. I can't actually do anything with it at this technology level, so I just hopped back in, and with some quick loading, because, yeah, there's that flipping forward tendency, which is why I made quick saves. Anyways, we were able to fly most of the way back to the Space Center before my fuel ran very low. And this thing is horrible at gliding. Those rocket engines are heavy, so it has to really descend. I decided not to land on the runway, even though that would penalize me with money, because I knew I could not stretch the glide. That is a very common problem in aviation, where people lose engine power and try to stretch the glide by pulling back, and it always ends in disaster and death. So don't do that. Just keep your best glide speed, which is kind of what I found with this thing, and you'll glide the furthest distance. Anyways, that's just advice for pilots, and I made a nice landing. Not quite as close as I'd like, but it was safe, and that's what's important. Anyways, recovery costs didn't really lose that much money, and I was happy to trade those few hundred credits for increased safety. Here's where I made that extended version. I added 2 more fuel tanks on the front and back, and it takes off horribly. It's sluggish and slow in comparison to the previous version, and very inefficient with fuel early on because it has to lug around that extra weight. But fortunately, once it burns off some of that fuel, it does make up for it, and it does have a slightly increased range. And it is less likely to flip forward because of that extra length, so I was pretty happy with it. Now I'm flying over to the mountains. I got kind of bored in the flight and decided to check the new cockpits, and the interior is, I don't know, I kind of like the old one, but this is cool. It's neat, it's different. Yeah, he can't see anything out the front of the window. And this plane has to fly at a very specific speed because that horizontal stabilizer is angled forward to push the back of the plane down. So I go too fast, it pitches up. If I go too slow, it pitches down because it's nose heavy. So maintaining a constant speed makes landings and regular flight possible. But I have a very narrow margin of speed that I have to stay in. But I'm okay with that. Anyways, here's an engine flip around by using just one of the two. That way I could get a little bit closer back to the Space Center by gliding and reducing the costs of those recovery teams to come out in their vehicles and tow me back to the Space Center. I did get science up in the Highlands. I still need mountain science, but I just really don't have the range with a rocket-powered plane to make it that far, and don't have the technology to do any other form of propulsion. Anyways, gliding down the hills so that I can get as close as possible to that Space Center. Ran out of fuel. And a nice gentle landing, not using the parachutes anymore because they're not really necessary with this longer version. It doesn't flip forward as easily. Anyways, those people came out. I lost a lot of money from their efforts, but I did find a cheaty way to get around them. I could have them put the plane in a boat, well not really, but we're going to go with that, and take it out to the island runway. And then fly around the island runway and not get charged because the boat's already there waiting to take me back. I don't think that made them happy. Bill or Bob got a nice jog up a mountain for no real reason. There was no science gains from this, but hey, exercise is important. Then we decided to do a few laps around the pattern of the airport just to see what it's like flying around here. This thing's takeoff distance is actually really good when you put those engines at full power. Rocket engines are very powerful. This isn't really full power, they're throttled back, but full power for what I'm comfortable using with them. Anyways, tried to flip around, tried to turn too tightly. Just not good, so do a go around. You can always do a go around. Very important to remember in traffic patterns. Well, you can't when you're out of fuel, but I had fuel, so we were good. Go a little further out, make a nice more gentle turn, and that greatly increases safety. So here we go around again. You can see just how hard it is to steer this plane. It takes a while because there's none of those moving fins, as I mentioned before, and those wings are not exactly the best. Now this is where the parachutes are handy because they can really reduce the stopping distance. So I decided to just use one, and then a combination of a little bit of engine power to give me some gimbal, and that allowed me to land. Now I did use my rocket sled after this to gather more science around the Space Center. Unfortunately, the sled was destroyed, so I lost some money, but the Kerbal survived, so that was fine. And I got some more science. We're now very close to being able to get heat shields. We got some experience. And yes, thank you so much for watching. Please comment. Your comments drive this series. Tell me anything and everything. And I hope you all have a very nice day.